Although this man is not as known as other drug kingpins like Escobar or El Chapo, he deserves to be on the same list as them. In the 1980s, this man ruled over the streets of LA during the largest drug epidemic America had ever seen. His biggest suppliers were caught up in shady government business, and the profits of his organization would turn out to fund military conflicts in Central America. His actions would expose CIA operations and lead to accusations made against President Reagan himself. Although he may be a product of his environment, this man made sure to step out of the shadow of his upbringing and acquire mass amounts of money in the process. This is the story of Freeway Ricky Ross, how an illiterate boy from the hood built a drug empire from nothing. Ricky Donnell Ross was born on January 26, 1960 in a small town in Texas. When he was 4 years old, Ross's mother moved to LA with him and his siblings. Ricky was raised in South Central LA, a neighborhood notorious for its high crime rates and high unemployment. In fact, Ricky himself was a witness of violence at a very young age. When Ricky was 5 years old, his mother killed her own brother in an act of self-defense. This left a big imprint on him and led to Ricky being a very anti-violent person. In South Central LA, chances were scarce. Ricky, however, saw an opportunity when he was about to finish high school. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Ricky played a lot of tennis. He started playing with some friends, but eventually began taking it more seriously. He participated in high school tournaments and was eventually offered a scholarship to play tennis. This could have really increased his chances from a very young age. Unfortunately, Ricky was not considered eligible for the program. Up until his adolescence, Ricky had never learned to read or write. This prohibited him from being accepted into the scholarship program and ended his chances of escaping poverty at a young age. In the late 1970s, the American economy went through a major shift. A lot of low education industry jobs disappeared and were outsourced to other countries. This meant that a lot of low educated people had very little job opportunities. A lot of people were let go from their job, and unemployment rates in South Central LA were sky high. This economic downturn coincided with the rise of cocaine as a mainstream drug in the US. Cocaine was trafficked from South America into the US, mainly by the use of mules. Young women from countries like Colombia and Bolivia would carry the illegal narcotics onto airplanes in the hopes of not getting caught. At the time, not that much was known about cocaine, especially in lower class neighborhoods. Cocaine was already popular in the 1920s, but would only be taken by the rich and famous of those times. When it hit the US in the late 1970s, however, everyone would be able to take part in it. Especially when in 1980, a different form of cocaine was introduced: crack, or as Bolivian suppliers called it, pichicata. This form of cocaine was cheaper, more addictive, and easily manufactured by local drug dealers. It was at this time that Ricky Ross decided to get into the drug dealing business. He started out as a small-time hustler, dealing cocaine on the streets of LA and supplying to people from his neighborhood. It wasn't too long, however, that Ricky found out how to manufacture crack cocaine all by himself. He saw this as a real opportunity. Crack cocaine was cheaper and therefore more accessible to the poorest in South Central LA, who were not able to afford the real cocaine. He began expanding his network, and some of his friends became partners in his organization. His expanding business gave him some serious notoriety in LA, and soon, a supplier named Danilo Blandon would make contact with Ross. Blandon was a Nicaraguan trafficker. He saw Ricky as a reliable contact in LA and would give him the tools to take his operation from amateur to professional in no time. Blandon supplied Ricky not only with drugs, but also with guns and money count machines. As mentioned before, Blandon was from the country of Nicaragua, a nation in Central America. In the 70s and 80s, Nicaragua was a war-torn country. A communist revolution took place in the 1970s, and in 1979, The communists took over completely. Blandon was an anti-communist and a so-called Contra. He was part of the Contra Revolution, a movement in place to remove the communist regime. The Contra movement was partially sponsored by the US government, who fought communist regimes all over the world. Another big part of the funding was done through the trafficking of illegal narcotics into the US. The Contras needed money, and Blandon was the guy who would get it for them. Ross and Blandon got along really well, also on a personal level. Ross even described him as somewhat of a father figure, something he did not have growing up. Business-wise, Ross wasn't doing so bad either. In the early to mid-80s, he was responsible for pushing some metric tons of crack and cocaine onto the streets of LA. He was head supplier of a large network of dealers and brought in massive quantities of cash. At the height of his operation, Ross claimed to have made more than $3 million per day, an incredible amount of money. Unfortunately for Ross, the police also became aware of these activities. With the appointment of Ronald Reagan as president in 1981, the so-called war on drugs was declared. And from that moment on, police funding had increased with the goal of taking down large drug networks. This resulted in Ricky's arrest in 1986. After a police chase through the city, Ricky was caught and detained by the LAPD. His case went to court but was eventually dismissed because the officers responsible for Ross's arrest had misconducted themselves during the arrest. And so for now, Ricky was off the hook. During this period, the crack epidemic in America reached low depths. One of Ricky's associates vowed to never sell drugs again after 10-year-old kids came knocking on his door to buy crack. The drug crisis was so out of control that elementary school kids were addicted. After his case was dismissed, Ricky moved to Ohio to escape the heat from the LA police. He found out that the demand for crack was very high in the Midwestern states, so he set up a supply network from there. In 1988, the war on drugs became even more dirty. As drug dealers started to get kidnapped by other criminals, firepower on the streets increased massively. For their protection, dealers and cops carried automatic pistols like Uzis, AK-47s, MAC-10s, and AR-15s. Not only did the firepower increase that year, police were starting to crack down more on the drug dealers, and through house raids, large sums of money were seized. This, however, led to a lot of corruption within the police departments, as some of the confiscated money was kept off the books and split between partners. So now US government officials were profiting financially from the war on drugs. This resulted in a very toxic environment. This is what a retired LA cop said about the situation at the time. Everybody came up with a new car. I bought a vacation home in Hawaii. The greed came in. We had gone from being cops to crooks, and we lived like them. In late 1988, Ricky Ross moved back to LA after becoming too involved with the police in Ohio. His plan was to continue selling drugs in LA until he made enough money to buy a couple of motels, so he could leave his drug empire behind. However, this plan never worked out. In early 1989, Ricky was arrested by the LA police. His arrest, however, sparked a lot of controversy, as he was beaten up by the arresting officers and got bitten by their dogs. Later that year, he was tried in front of a jury and sentenced to 5 years in prison. When Ross got out of prison in 1994, he decided it was time to turn around his life. He used his influence in South Central LA to start a community center that would prevent kids from getting involved in the drug business. Things went pretty well for a while. Rick reconnected with his kids and even helped his mom in the local church. However, this would turn out to be a short period of happiness in Ricky's life. In early 1995, Ricky and his former associates started getting phone calls from their old partner, Danilo Blandon. Blandon had come out of prison a few months prior and had secretly made a deal with the DEA to become part of a witness protection program. Blandon offered Ross a deal he couldn't refuse, and even though Ricky seemed a changed man, he agreed to buy drugs from Blandon. And when he and Danilo met on March 3rd, 1995, Ricky was arrested by the FBI and charged with trying to buy 100 kilos of cocaine. In the end, Ricky was betrayed by the very same man who was a father figure to him. Ricky's trial made national headlines and caught the attention of journalist Gary Webb. He found evidence that Danilo Blandon had been dealing with the CIA for far longer than was thought. He went down to Nicaragua to investigate links between the CIA, Blandon, and the Contra Revolution in Nicaragua. Webb claims that the American crack epidemic was part of a larger conspiracy. He has shown evidence that Blandon was hired by the CIA to traffic cocaine into the US, with the aim of using the profits to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. The news articles following this investigation led to a major shock in the US, especially among the lower-class black communities. These communities were harshly affected by the influx of crack, as the drug epidemic had left many impoverished or homeless. They felt betrayed by their own government and claimed they were used to fund a military operation thousands of miles away. In spite of all allegations made against the CIA and Blandon, Ricky Ross was sentenced to life in prison. For many people, this will be the end of the story, but not for Ross. Ross was 28 years old and still illiterate when he went back into prison. That's when he decided to do something about that. He started learning his ABCs, and from years on end, he read and studied every day. And when his comprehension level was high enough, he decided to look into his own case. Ricky was sentenced to life according to the 3-strike rule. This means that if you commit 3 of the same offenses, you will face serious jail time in the USA. Ricky, however, found out that the 3-strike principle did not apply to his case. And in a higher appeal, Ricky's sentence was reduced to 20 years. In 2009, at 49 years of age, Ricky was released from federal prison. Now, the name Rick Ross may sound familiar to you, as there is also a rapper who is named Rick Ross. The rapper, whose real name is William Leonard Roberts, was sued by Ricky Ross in 2010 over copyright infringement, as Ross claimed that Roberts used his name and image to build his brand as a rapper, which had helped Roberts make serious money. A judge, however, ruled in favor of Roberts, the rapper, and in 2013, Ross was fined with paying the procedure costs of $490,000. After his prison release in 2009, Ricky hasn't touched a gram of cocaine. His main line of work these days is speaking to teenagers in the black community or paying visits to juvenile detention centers to share the dangers of living a life of crime. In 2014, Ross released a book describing his controversial life. After totaling profits of $900 million, Ricky Ross's days of drug trafficking are over. His story, albeit a cautionary one, shows how anyone can rise up from humble beginnings. Ross never took his situation for granted, and even when he was sentenced to life in prison, he refused to accept that. Ross's story is exemplary for what can be achieved if you keep getting up when you're down.